the recording. Okay. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to our Coping with the Crisis. We're continuing our conversation. And this week, our speaker is Mother Carlisle Gill, who is one of the associate priests here at St. Peter's. Carlisle has, as you all know, a very deep experience and knowledge of all kinds of spiritual resources. She has served the church in a wide variety of capacities in her career, and we're really blessed to have her here with us this evening to speak about spiritual resources for this time when we're coping with the crisis. So without further ado, Carlisle.
Okay, thank you. So you all can hear me and see me, I assume. I'm always wondering about how this works, but anyway, here we are, assuming that all is well in terms of the technology. I want to speak to you this evening about spiritual practice and sort of the general flow of the evening is this. I'm going to suggest 3 areas of spiritual practice: accept and embrace, pay attention, and simply being. In each of those areas, I am going to suggest some actual practices. But first, I want to do a little introduction to it all. I want to say at the outset, I know each of you is engaged in some form of spiritual practice during this time, and that what I'm about to share with you is only suggestive and not prescriptive. And I intend for this evening to be a conversation. I want to hear about your spiritual practice and how it is for you. The other day, I had a wonderful conversation with the Centering Prayer Group about their own spiritual practices during this time. And so this is a wonderful opportunity to go even farther and wider. So I'm hoping that at the very end of my presentation, you all will step up to the proverbial plate and share, okay? So a song has been going through my mind during the last few weeks that actually I heard on a Hulu show. The Hulu show is Mrs. America. Some of you may be watching it. And somehow or another, they were playing a song from the mid-60s. Some of you may remember this song. It is "What the World Needs Now is Love, Sweet Love." Now, if it were the talent show, I'd sing it for you, but I'm not going to do that. As songs often do, they lodge in my brain, and I find it hard to get rid of them, and this one I don't want to get rid of. Because I think it's a song exactly for our time. What the world needs now is love, sweet love. Love of ourselves, love of our neighbors, and love of our God. As I watch the news, and I'm sure as you watch the news, my heart breaks when I see people who are so horribly affected by this pandemic, people who are just on the edge, if not over the edge, financially going to food banks when they've never done that in their lives. And I'm worried, as I'm sure you are worried, that we are going to go back too soon and more people will be sick and die. The words of the prophet Micah come to me. What doth the Lord require of thee, but to love justice, do mercy, and walk humbly with thy God? So anyway, I think that love actually is the spiritual practice and the one for our time. I wish, as I was thinking as I put this together, that we were on retreat together, but in fact, we are on retreat together. We are holed up in our homes for the most part, and in fact, given the opportunity to go deeper. And in some ways, I think that is a real gift. What I want to offer to you in terms of spiritual practice is actually is it's an offering. It's not meant to be a cure. It's not meant to fix it. It's not meant to even be a how to get through these times. It's more meant to offer you a way of being in any time, and to deepen our cumulative and collective wisdom, most especially as we learn more about how to love. I want to begin with Jesus. It's always a good place to begin. Jesus had a conversation, as you remember, with a lawyer who wanted to trip him up and said, "So Jesus, how will I inherit eternal life?" Or retranslated, "What must I do to really come alive?" And as the 4th century Bishop Irenaeus said, the glory of God is humanity fully alive. Jesus answered the lawyer by saying, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love your neighbor as yourself." So being fully alive on the lips of Jesus is a spiritual practice, and it is foundational in the practice of love. Loving God, loving ourselves, and loving our neighbors. And I think this evening about spiritual practice is a perfect segue to all the evenings that have preceded it. Because in order, I think, to go deeply into the spiritual life, especially during this time, we need to acknowledge how difficult the times are in which we live, how dark our emotions are, how hard to accept all of this it is, how difficult it is to deal with the unknown. So that leads me to my first sort of general area of spiritual practice, which I call accept and embrace. There's a wonderful Buddhist nun and teacher whose name is Pema Chodron. Some of you know of Pema Chodron, and she's written a fabulous book. It's called When Things Fall Apart. And this is one of the things that she says. Things falling apart is a kind of testing and also a kind of healing. We think that the point is to pass the test or overcome the problem. But the truth is that things don't really get solved. They come together and they fall apart. They come together again and they fall apart again. It's just like that. The healing comes from letting there be room for all this to happen. Room for grief, room for relief, room for misery, room for joy. Boy, and I don't know what you think, but I think that's a very wise view. Healing comes from letting there be room for all of this to happen, from our grief to our joy. So I think it's important to develop the capacity to hold all of this, to hold our grief, our relief, our misery, our joy, our whatever. A seminary professor of mine said long ago, the more we have to hold in our lives, the more we have to hold, the more spirit we need to help with the holding. I think we can see that, and certainly we see it in Jesus' life. Life is a great teacher. Each of us is old enough to have endured much. And each of us has learned by now that some of the hardest experiences in our lives have been the greatest teachers. You know that I have said to people that having breast cancer was one of my best and most powerful spiritual teachers and awakenings. Another seminary professor of mine, whose son very tragically committed suicide, said this, I have been to the bottom and it holds. So there are 3 actual practices that help me accept and embrace. One, of course, is a long and developed and multifaceted practiced faith. I turn to scripture stories for help, especially to the Psalms. And of course, you know, I mean by faith not something literal or linear, but a seasoned relationship with God that has ups and downs, presences and absences. It grows and changes. It is the backdrop for all of my practices. It is the ground, as theologian Paul Tillich said, of my being. Another practice that helps me accept and embrace comes from my practice of centering prayer and my practice of Buddhist meditation. I would call it a witnessing practice. We can, when we are still enough, listen, see deeply, and feel as witnesses. It gives us the opportunity to respond in a situation instead of react. So in other words, I can, if I am able to be in that witness place, I can say to myself, this is what sadness feels like. And I can investigate it and inquire about it. Or this is what anger feels like. So you see, it gives us a little bit of space between a powerful feeling and often an opportunity to react. It gives us enough space to respond. Now, I want to tell you that doesn't always happen for me. That's why it's called a practice. Tonight is an example of it. Carol and I went down to Touch of Italy to pick up our dinner, and I was backing out of my parking space when I hit a tree. Now, I cannot tell you that I became a witness at that moment. I did not. Stress really heightens our proclivity to react. But it is possible with practice to witness and to learn a lot. It also helps in what I described earlier as the holding process, as what we hold. I've recently discovered another accept and embrace practice, and you're going to remember it because it has a great name. It's called Pet the Lizard. Yeah, got that? Pet the Lizard. It comes from a man named Rick Hansen. Some of you may know of Rick Hansen. He is a psychologist and has a special interest in neurobiology, neuroplasticity, actually. And he talks about a way to deal with fear. And fear is a very present feeling during this time. He knows and talks about our brains in this regard. Our reptilian brain is pre-hardwired to notice and respond to fear almost in a heartbeat. It's really hard to be a witness to fear. But what he talks about is, when he talks about petting the lizard, he said as a kid, he used to be afraid of lizards. And so when he got one, he decided to pet it. He grew up in Southern California where there are tons of them. So he decided just to pet the lizard a little bit, and it calmed his fear. What he actually recommends in this practice called Pet the Lizard is that we remember and settle ourselves in feelings that can be stronger than our fears. This is the neuroplasticity part. Training the brain to go to a place of awareness and remembrance of safety, protection, wellness, soothing, So there are ways to soothe ourselves, which have to do with taking deep breaths, being comfortable in our bodies, and bringing to our awareness that we are safe. We have the necessary things to survive, and we are doing just fine, and we are alive and well. And when we settle ourselves in these things, we can pet the lizard. Okay, accept and embrace is a way of coming fully alive, because it is only as we accept and embrace all of ourselves that we are really fully capable of loving. We also have an added benefit, bonus, gift, I think is the actual best word. And that is the action of God's unconditional love for each and every one of us. Gospel story after gospel story is about God's unconditional love for us. That we can trust and rest in. I think the fact that the parish is talking so much about what's really true right now is fabulous. And it is a way that I see that we are collectively engaging this practice of acceptance and embrace. So the second spiritual practice, sort of generally, I would call paying attention. And it is among my favorites. Writers and poets know it well. Presbyterian minister Frederick Buechner has written a wonderful, wonderful story called The Innkeeper. Some of you may know this story. In it, he tells the story of the innkeeper. Yes, he says, the innkeeper says, I am the one, I said no room. But if you want to tell the truth, you have to tell the whole truth, perhaps with a catch in your voice or maybe even a tear in your eye. He goes on to say, do you know what it's like to run an inn? It's like being lost in the forest of a million trees, and every tree is a thing to be done. And so what am I to tell you? When the baby came, when no one turns into someone, when the baby came, I missed him. All your life long, you wait for your own true love to come. And what am I to tell you? When he came, I missed him. This is a very poignant story, I think, because it reveals our often lostness in the forest of a million trees, a million things to be done, so that we are incapable of paying attention. Simone Weil, another wonderful spiritual writer, defined prayer this way. Prayer is paying attention. Poets are really good at it. And you know Mary Oliver is among my favorites. And this is what Mary Oliver says about paying attention. What I want to describe in my poems is the nudge, the prick of the instant, the flame of appreciation that shoots from my heels to my head. Living like this, for me, is the difference between a luminous life and a ho-hum life. My affinity is to the whimsical, the illustrative, the suggestive, not to the factual or the useful. I walk and I notice. I am sensual in order to be spiritual. Isn't that a great line? I am sensual in order to be spiritual. Mary Oliver has written a wonderful poem called Praying, and it goes like this. It doesn't have to be the blue iris. It could be weeds in a vacant lot or a few small stones. Just pay attention. Then patch a few words together. Don't try to make them elaborate. This isn't a contest, but an invitation, a doorway into thanks, and a silence in which another voice may speak. She asks a wonderful question at the end of her poem, Evidence. I ask you again, if you have not been enchanted by this adventure, your life, what would do for you? Anglican Benedictine and writer Esther de Waal once said that she carries a magnifying glass with her on her walks so that she can pay close attention. And I have been on retreat with Esther de Waal, and I've actually seen that magnifying glass hanging around her neck. Annie Dillard wrote a book that many of you, I'm sure, have read called Pilgrim at Tinker Creek. And she tells in it the story that comes from her childhood, from growing up in Pittsburgh. And she said that she was a little girl, would go out onto the sidewalk and plant pennies all along the sidewalk. And then she would, in chalk, as only a kid would do on a sidewalk, she would say things like, surprise ahead, money this way. She would go into the bushes and hide and see if people would stop to pick up the pennies that she had planted. She says this, if you cultivate a healthy poverty and simplicity so that finding a penny will literally make your day, then, since the world is in fact planted in pennies, you have with your poverty bought a lifetime of days. It is that simple. What you see is what you get. When I was on retreat, often in the high desert of Southern California, when I was working in Santa Monica, I developed my own practice of paying attention. I call it padding. It's a very simple practice. Essentially, you walk very slowly, notice as much as you can, allow yourself to be surprised by what you see, take nothing for granted, and there's only one rule to padding. Never, never be in a hurry. So the third area of practice I call simply being. Now, it may be the hardest of all, actually, because our culture has conditioned us to be doers, performers, achievers, all of those things, so that simply being may be almost impossible. But it is a spiritual practice, and it can be a wonderful one. For me, simply being takes many forms. It can be a slow meditative walk, like I mentioned just a short while ago. Sometimes when I'm on Buddhist Sangha retreats at St. Peter's, I do what's called meditative walking. It's basically walking slowly, and you would be amazed at what you can see in the cemetery at St. Peter's if you walk slowly enough. But my chief practice of simply being is the discipline of centering prayer. And centering prayer is simply the consent to the presence and action of God within. It is the practice of letting go, self-emptying, and it is not easy. Some have said it was Jesus's core spiritual practice. We hear about it every Palm Sunday in Paul's letter to the Philippians. when he says Jesus did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant. It's not easy in a culture that is so steeped in having and hoarding and holding on to empty, but it is a practice and a quite wonderful one in my view. Cynthia Bourgeault, some of you know, has written extensively about centering prayer. She calls it contemplation, not meditation, because she says contemplative prayer means that one is caught, held from the other side, dancing with a partner. Contemplation, she says, is a deeply relational practice with God, of course. She just did a 3-day presentation that some of you and I saw, and she shared with us some poems that Thomas Keating wrote as he was dying. And I'm hoping it's okay for me to share one, because it sort of speaks to this simply being. Here's the poem from Thomas Keating. Our true nature is stillness, the source from which we came. It manifests within us as a rising tide of silence, a flowing stream of peacefulness, a limitless ocean of calm, or just sheer stillness. The deep listening of pure contemplation is the path to stillness. All words disappear into it, and all creatures awaken to the delight of just being. Richard Rohr, in his book, The Universal Christ, offers a number of simply being practices, and one is absolutely and extraordinarily simple. It's called Simply That You Are. Rohr says this: offer up your simple naked being to the joyful being of God. For you two are one in grace, although separate by nature. Don't focus on what you are, but simply that you are. Simply that you are. Your own body in its naked being with no doing involved becomes the place of revelation and inner rest. Simply that you are. It's a great practice, actually. It can be done in front of a mirror. Just look at yourself and think about that simply you are. You might even think and remember that the Hebrew word for God, Yahweh, is I am. Anyway, the best way to learn about centering prayer is to do it. And this is a short little ad for the Centering Prayer Group at St. Peter's. It meets on Wednesdays at 1:30. We're also reading a couple of books. So, 3 general areas of spiritual practice: accept and embrace, paying attention, and simply being. There are many resources that I want to share with you, but I'm going to stop now because I think I have reached the 25-minute limit, and find out from you all what kinds of practices you are engaged in or what kinds of questions you have. So, Jeffrey, turning it over to you, moderator, and let's see where we go. Okay?
All right. Thank you, Carlisle. Do we have anyone who's willing to either share spiritual practices that they've found helpful or would like to ask a question of Carlisle? Oh, okay. Eleanor?
I just want to thank you, first of all, during this chaotic time. I'm finding the morning prayer and evening prayer help sort of envelope my day So it keeps me stable. And then Carlisle, Cynthia Bourgeot did something at those lectures that I've been meaning to tell you about, and you brought it to mind. And I'm probably going to mess it up, but she, I think, ended her meditation in, be still and know that I am God. Be still and know, be still, be. And I'm trying to figure out whether I want that at the beginning of centering prayer or after, because it's very powerful.
Yes, she did. It was wonderful.
Thank you, Eleanor. Is there someone else who would like to share a practice or to ask a question?
Is that Jody?
Yep,
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jody.
Thank you. Carlisle, thank you so much for just enumerating the simplicity of accepting and embracing, of paying attention and just being. And that can be a struggle to just be. And I think those of us who are of a more extroverted personality sometimes struggle with the just being. But in this time, even though my schedule has not been as interrupted as yours have been, I have been creating a space in my second bedroom, and I'm calling it my prayer room or my meditation room. And I've created like a wall of icons of just saints and people who have guided me through my life. Some of the, Catherine of Siena, Teresa of Avila, Mother Seton, and it's just creating that, and then just being in front of it sometimes is just enough. Like I feel like I'm in the company of saints. And so it's been kind of fun to create this space. And I don't think it'll ever be finished, because I keep, I think I shared this with some people in EFM. I had a huge set of rosary beads from a friend of mine who was a Sister of Mercy back in the day when they wore the full habit, and they wore the rosaries on a cincture at their waist. And when she died, her family gave me her rosaries. I mean, they're just stunning. And I'm deciding, I think, what I'm going to do with those. Like, am I going to hang it on the wall? Am I going to whatever? But I just find myself in this little space of remembering and praying and being in the presence of people who've been in my life. And I believe it's orchestrated by God. I feel that way.
It reminds me of Donna's conversation about being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses. And I remember another seminary professor of mine, when he was giving a lecture on Anglicanism, and he always had great gestures with his hands. He said, Anglicanism is a tradition of persons. And I think that's true, that each of us has a tradition of persons in our lives who've been very influential spiritually, and how fabulous to be able to call upon them.
Anyone else? Oh, here we have Marianne.
I think for me, I'm trying to get into a daily meditation or contemplation, and I don't think I'm as successful as I'd like to be. But I think one thing I try to do every day is come up with 5 things I'm grateful for, and to make them different each day. And there's so much in common, I tend to go over. But I think that's okay. And I think if you do that at the beginning of the day or the end of the day, or both, that's a form.
Yes. Yes. Gratitude is a wonderful spiritual practice. Really wonderful. Absolutely.
Tom was going to add to something.
Yeah, thank you, Carlisle, for this good presentation. I really do appreciate it. As I was thinking, Donna and I were talking today, and I was thinking about my own practice and what I would say tonight. And I would say that there are two different parts of my spiritual practice. One is that sometimes about 6, maybe 8 times a day, I just stop. I just stop and become aware of sacred presence. I'm not always comfortable with the word God, but that's what I mean, a sacred presence that is surrounds me and that I feel is holding me. And I was taught this by Marcus Borg a number of years ago, about 20, 25 years ago. We had him come speaking, and we were, it was an interesting occasion, an occurrence. We were at Christ Church Greenville, and on a Saturday morning at 9 o'clock, and the place was filled. There were lay people sitting up in the choir, sitting down on the floor. We had standing room only. And Marcus was almost tearful when he said, look at how many people want to talk about Jesus. And what he talked about in the speech was something that taught me that I'll never forget. He said, I just stop during the day. I just stop and become awake. And the word Buddha means to wake up. And what I do is just like I was hoeing in my garden today to plant some tomatoes, and then just stop for a while and said, oh, there it is. There's the spirit, the sacred presence around me that's holding me always. And then what I do when I stop is to say my mantra. My mantra now for a couple of years has been one that Richard Rohr taught me. And that is that matter and spirit are one. Matter and spirit are absolutely inseparable. And that's very helpful for me to simply stop and be awake and to be aware of sacred presence. The other thing is a thing that I allow a spiritual teacher of mine named Krista Griffin she does a meditation during this pandemic each morning at 7:30, and I watch that 2 or 3 times a week and let her be my guide in my meditation to what she would call energy. As an alchemist, I would call spirit, and that is to once again to become aware of that spirit that is always around us and within us. And so it's a twofold practice. And really appreciate your leading us in this tonight.
And I know that there are practices from other traditions. Some of you are working on being with Rabbi Beth Cohen, doing the Musar practice. And I think some of you are here tonight. And I know that George Beckerman knows a lot about that. I bought the book. I haven't read the book yet, but it looks like a fabulous practice. So there's that. There are so many. Anybody else want to share something about your own practice during this time? What's helping you survive? George, Go ahead,
George.
I'm reminded in this wonderful discussion, a survey course, part 1 of a survey course of spiritual practices. I'm new to it overall. I've been involved for 6 or 7 years. And Mary Helms and Thomas Merton, among others, brought me into it. Along the way, I've had several spiritual advisors and spiritual companions. And one of those companions, a Merton scholar who was down here once or twice, Sister Kathleen Degnan, a nun who teaches at Iona University, and I had a long relationship of spiritual companioning over the phone for a few years. And in the midst of that relationship, Mary was attacked by ALS, and I observed to Sister Kathleen that the time that I was spending in caretaking, in caregiving, took away time, voluntarily took away time from my spiritual practices. And it didn't take but a few seconds for Sister Kathleen to say, George, caregiving for Mary is your spiritual practice. And I think in these times, and with all of us in this group and our intersecting circles through these wonderful communities within which we live, the idea of caretaking, of looking after the other, looking after ourselves as a spiritual practice, when it's done thoughtfully and alive and being present in it, is an extraordinary, extraordinary spiritual practice, which is nourished by, I mean, you're really dealing with life and death in some of these circumstances. So it's nourished by the kinds of practices, Carlisle, that you were describing and alluding to from other faith traditions. So thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Any other thoughts or comments, questions, ponderings? Well, Mother Carlisle, I think you get the last word.
Wow, that's exciting. Well, I guess this is not a last word, but it's a sort of a resource. And many of these resources are ones that you are aware of. Every morning I get something from an outfit in Towson, Maryland called Well for the Journey. And it's a little snippet of something, but it's just always provocative and really great for my soul. And then I also get what some of you also get every morning, something from gratefulness.org. And it's always a wonderful eye-opener, heart opener to gratitude, which is a fabulous way to start the day. These are easy to get online if you'd like to get them. And then, of course, Richard Rohr and the Center for Action and Contemplation, he puts out something every day on a topic. For example, this week, he's been talking about, or having others talk about, Julian of Norwich, the famous all will be well and all manner of thing be well, who of course lived during a similar time to this one, actually. So those are among many online practices, and we could actually probably pool our resources and share. I think there are some books that are very helpful. Richard Rohr is an extremely good writer about the spiritual life, and in a very broad way. And one of his best books, I think, is called The Naked Now. That's a good book. There's another writer that I found very helpful, whose name is Martin Laird, and he's written a book called Into the Silent Land. But of course, I'm biased toward the contemplative side, so these are pretty contemplative kinds of books. Then there's also Thomas Keating, Open Mind, Open Heart. And I think, and there are lots of, things that we could all contribute and develop perhaps a resource for spiritual practice and awareness. So I don't know how we might do that, but I would be certainly willing to help that happen. And for those of you who might be interested, the Centering Prayer Group actually is meeting by Zoom at 1:30 on Wednesdays, and we did read Richard Rohr's Universal Christ and finished it, and we were going to start Julia Gatta's life in Christ. We're kind of moving around in books, but it's a place where you can engage these topics and these issues. And I think that's a great thing during this time, during any time. So that's my last words.
Well, and I just, on behalf of Carlisle and Ray, Mark, and Ted, and I mean, we are all very willing to talk to each of you at any time about spiritual resources that you might take advantage of. Each one of us has a very different kind of expertise and bent, and that's one of the great gifts of being in St. Peter's. But feel free to approach any of us at any time. We would be glad to share with you ideas and things that might be helpful for you in your spiritual life. And I just want to say a word of thanks to Carlisle. It's been a tremendous gift in my time here at St. Peter's to have her presence, her prayerful presence in our midst. She is just a tremendous gift to the church, and we're lucky that she chooses to be here at St. Peter's with all of us. So in the midst of moving this week, she just knocked this little thing out for us tonight. So Carlisle, thank you so much.
You're so welcome.
Our speaker next week will be Dr. Ted Wilson. He's a psychologist here in Lewes. He works a lot with children and families. He'll be talking about what normal anxiety and normal depression is like in difficult times, and how to tell the difference between the situational experiences that we might be having right now and something that is deeper and much more pervasive in need of attention and help. So Ted is not with us here tonight, so I can't point him out to you, but he will be with us next week. And if there's anything any of you need, I just remind you to feel free to give us a call here at the office. We're glad to be here for you. You can also get me at any time on my cell phone. The talent show is up. It is not a YouTube thing. It is on our stpeterslewes.org website. If you go to the website and click on media and then click on talent show, you will find a number of us doing some attempts at being entertaining. I read a short story called Ema Dream, and there are other options up there as well. So please take a time to at least laugh at us, if not laugh with us during this time of pandemic. It's great to be with all of you, and I thank you for tuning in, and we'll look forward to seeing you next week. May God bless you and keep you, and may the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be merciful to you, and the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen, friends.
Amen.
Good night.
Good night.